The autumn wind carried fallen leaves across the parking lot of Hartwell Community Center as a small figure made her way toward the front entrance. Her name was Eleanor Vance and she was 72 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun and deep lines around her eyes that told stories of decades lived fully. She wore a faded brown cardigan that had seen better days and comfortable orthopedic shoes that made soft sounds against the concrete as she walked. Had just moved to this quiet town 3 weeks ago after spending most of her adult life in distant places that most people in this community had only seen in photographs. She came here for one reason and one reason only, which was to be closer to her granddaughter Mia, who worked in the nearby city as a music journalist. The years of living alone in European apartments had finally worn her down and she longed for family and for something that felt like home again. The community center was a modest building with brick walls and large windows that let in the morning light. Inside there was a bulletin board covered with flyers for yoga classes and book clubs and community dinners. Eleanor studied the board carefully until her eyes landed on a small blue flyer that read Piano for Beginners, and underneath it said, "All ages welcome and no experience necessary." A young woman sat behind the front desk, typing on a computer and chewing gum with her mouth open. She could not have been older than 25, with bright pink hair and earphones hanging around her neck. When Eleanor approached the desk, the young woman looked up and immediately her expression changed to that particular kind of patience that young people reserve for the elderly. "I help you, ma'am?" the receptionist asked in a voice that was just a little too loud. As if she assumed Eleanor might be hard of hearing, Eleanor smiled warmly because she had grown used to this kind of treatment over the years. "I would like to sign up for the piano class, please," she said in a soft voice that carried a hint of an accent that was hard to place. The receptionist, whose name tag read Brittany, pulled out a registration form and began speaking very slowly. "So this is our beginner class," she explained while pointing at each word on the form as if Eleanor might not understand. "It meets every Tuesday and Thursday morning at 10. The teacher is Marcus Chen and he is really good, like professionally trained and everything." Eleanor nodded and filled out the form with a steady hand. Her handwriting was elegant and precise, which Brittany noticed with a small look of surprise. When Eleanor handed back the form, Brittany glanced at it and said, "The first class is tomorrow and you should get here a little early to find a good seat." The next morning, Eleanor arrived at the community center exactly 15 minutes before class was scheduled to begin. She found the music room at the end of a long hallway and stepped inside to discover a space that smelled of old wood and lemon cleaning solution. There were 6 electronic keyboards set up in rows and one ancient upright piano pushed against the far wall. The upright was clearly the oldest instrument in the room, with chipped keys and a scratch running down its side. Other students began filtering in, and Eleanor observed them quietly. There was a retired accountant named Frank who wanted to learn piano to impress his grandchildren. There was a woman named Doris who was 68 and had always dreamed of playing music but never had the time when she was working. There was a shy young man named Timothy who had failed piano lessons as a child and wanted to try again. They were all genuine beginners with hope in their eyes and nervousness in their hands. Then the teacher walked in and the room seemed to shift around him. Marcus Chen was 34 years old, with sharp features and black hair that fell perfectly across his forehead. He wore expensive clothes that seemed out of place in this humble community center, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed he deserved better than this. His eyes swept across the room and landed briefly on each student before moving on with barely concealed disappointment. "Good morning, everyone," he said in a voice that was polite but not warm. "I am Marcus Chen and I will be your instructor for this beginner piano course. I trained at the Thornwood Conservatory and I have performed with several professional orchestras." His words hung in the air like a reminder that he was doing them a favor by being here. Marcus began assigning seats and keyboards to each student. When he reached Eleanor, he barely glanced at her before gesturing toward the old upright piano in the corner. "You can use that one," he said without explanation. "It is a bit out of tune, but it will work fine for basic exercises." Eleanor made her way to the corner without complaint and sat down on the worn bench. She rested her hands in her lap and waited patiently while Marcus continued his introduction. He explained the structure of the course and the basics of music theory and the importance of daily practice. His tone suggested that he did not expect much from any of them. As the lesson began, Marcus demonstrated simple hand positions on his own keyboard, which was clearly the newest and most expensive instrument in the room. He played a basic 5-note scale and asked the students to repeat it. The room filled with hesitant plinking sounds as the beginners tried to find the right keys. Honor placed her fingers on the yellowed keys of the old upright, and something stirred deep inside her chest. It was a feeling she had not experienced in many years, and it was both wonderful and painful at the same time. She played the simple scale, but she deliberately positioned her fingers incorrectly, just slightly off from proper. Marcus walked between the keyboards offering corrections and criticisms. When he reached Eleanor, he sighed and shook his head. "Your hand position is all wrong," he said, while adjusting her fingers with clinical detachment. "You need to curve your fingers more and keep your wrists relaxed." "Have you ever touched a piano before?" "Only a little," Eleanor replied with a gentle smile. I am afraid I am quite rusty. Marcus nodded as if this confirmed what he already believed. Well, just try to follow along as best you can, he said before moving on to the next student, Doris, who was seated at the keyboard. Nearest to Eleanor leaned over and whispered, "He is brilliant but insufferable, is he not? I heard he was supposed to be some big concert pianist, but something happened and now he is stuck teaching people like us." Eleanor chuckled softly and nodded. "He does seem rather serious," she agreed. The class continued for another hour with Marcus demonstrating increasingly basic concepts while sighing at the mistakes his students made. When it finally ended, the other students gathered their belongings and filed out while chatting about how difficult it was and how much they needed to practice. Eleanor remained seated at the old upright and told Marcus she wanted to stay a few extra minutes to practice her scales. He waved his hand dismissively and said that was fine before leaving to get coffee alone. In the room, Eleanor sat very still for a long moment. Then her fingers began to move across the keys, and the sound that emerged was nothing like the clumsy plinking of a beginner. It was fluid and precise and achingly beautiful. A melody poured out of her that spoke of longing and loss and love. The old piano seemed to come alive under her touch, as if it had been waiting decades for someone who truly knew how to play it. Then Eleanor heard footsteps in the hallway and she stopped abruptly. Her hands returned to her lap and her face settled back into the pleasant expression of a harmless elderly woman who was simply trying to learn something new. She did not know that her life was about to become very complicated, and she did not know that the music she had buried for 15 years was already beginning to find its way back to the surface. All she knew was that for one brief moment the keys had felt like home again, and that feeling was both a blessing and a warning of things to come. 2 weeks had passed since Eleanor Vance joined the beginner piano class at Hartwell Community Center, and in that time she had become a quiet fixture in the corner of the music room. She arrived early to every class, and she sat at the same worn upright piano with its yellowed keys and scratched wooden frame. She smiled at the other students and she asked simple questions, and she made all the mistakes that a true beginner would make. Marcus Chen had settled into a rhythm of teaching that was more about endurance than enthusiasm. He would arrive exactly on time with a large coffee in his hand and a look on his face that suggested he would rather be anywhere else. His lessons were technically correct, but they lacked warmth, and his corrections often came with sighs that made his students feel small. Today he stood at the front of the room with a pointer in his hand, gesturing at a diagram of the piano keyboard that he had drawn on a whiteboard. "This is middle C," he explained for what felt like the 100th time. "Everything in music relates back to middle C, so you need to find it without looking. Close your eyes and feel for it." The students dutifully closed their eyes and fumbled across their keyboards. Frank, the retired accountant, hit the wrong key 3 times before finding the right one. Doris found it quickly, but then second-guessed herself and moved to the wrong note. Timothy, the shy young man, froze entirely with his hands hovering above the keys as if he was afraid to make a mistake. Eleanor closed her eyes and her fingers moved with perfect precision directly to middle C. Then at the last moment she shifted slightly to the left and pressed the wrong key. She opened her eyes with a look of innocent confusion and said, "Oh dear, I was so certain that was correct." Marcus walked over to her and looked down at her hands with the expression of a doctor examining a particularly difficult patient. "Your spatial awareness needs work," he said while repositioning her hand. "At your age it can be harder to develop muscle memory, but if you practice every day, you might see some improvement." "Thank you," Eleanor replied with genuine warmth in her voice. "I appreciate your patience with an old woman like me." Marcus nodded curtly and moved on to correct the next student. He did not notice the smile that played at the corners of Eleanor's mouth, or the way her eyes followed him with something that might have been amusement during the break between exercises. Doris moved her chair closer to Eleanor and lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I found out more about our dear teacher," she said with obvious relish. "Apparently he was quite the rising star about 10 years ago, and he won some big competition in New York. Everyone thought he would be the next great concert pianist." Eleanor raised her eyebrows with interest. "What happened?" she asked. Doris shrugged and glanced toward Marcus, who was checking his phone with an irritated expression. "Nobody knows for certain, but he never got the big break he was waiting for. Some say he choked during an important audition, and others say he made enemies with the wrong people in the music world. Either way, he ended up here teaching beginners, and you can tell he thinks it is beneath him." Eleanor nodded slowly and looked at Marcus with new understanding. There was something familiar about his frustration and his wounded pride. She had seen it before in young musicians who believed that talent alone should be enough to guarantee success. They did not yet understand that the world of music was as much about luck and timing and politics as it was about skill. The lesson resumed, and Marcus announced that he would demonstrate a simple melody for them to learn. He sat down at his keyboard with exaggerated formality, and his fingers began to move across the keys. The piece was a basic arrangement of a folk song, and he played it competently but without any real feeling. His technique was flawless, but the music felt empty somehow, as if he was going through the motions without actually connecting to the notes. When he finished, he looked up at the class with an expectant expression. "That is what we are working toward," he said. "Simple, clean, precise. Now each of you try the first 4 measures." The room filled with the sounds of struggling beginners and wrong notes and frustrated sighs. Eleanor placed her hands on the keys of her old upright and deliberately played the melody with mechanical stiffness. She hit the right notes, but she made them sound clumsy and uncertain. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to play it properly, but she forced herself to hold back. Marcus circled the room, offering criticism that was more discouraging than helpful. "Frank, you are rushing," he said. "Doris, your dynamics are all wrong." Timothy, stop hesitating and just commit to the notes. When he reached Eleanor, he listened for a moment and then shook his head. "You are playing the notes correctly, but there is no feeling," he said, with a hint of condescension. "Music is not just about hitting the right keys and act. At this stage, I do not expect you to understand that, but eventually you need to learn to express emotion through your playing." Eleanor nodded humbly and said, "I will try harder." After class ended, and the other students had left, Eleanor remained at her piano as had become her habit. Marcus gathered his things and paused at the door. "You really should practice at home if you want to improve," he said. "Staying late will not help much if you are just repeating the same mistakes." "I know," Eleanor replied, "but there is something about this old piano that I find comforting. It has character." Marcus snorted dismissively. "It has problems," he corrected. "That piano is at least 50 years old, and it is barely holding together. The community center keeps promising to replace it, but they never have the budget. Perhaps old things still have value," Eleanor said quietly, and there was something in her voice that made Marcus pause for just a moment before shaking his head and leaving alone. Now, Eleanor sat in the silence of the empty room and let her shoulders relax. She looked down at the keys that had become so familiar to her over these past 2 weeks, and she felt the weight of everything she was hiding. It was exhausting to play badly on purpose, and it was painful to hold back the music that wanted to pour out of her. She began to play softly at first, and then with growing confidence. The melody that emerged was not the simple folk song Marcus had taught them, but something far more complex. It was Chopin, and she played it from memory with the kind of effortless mastery that comes only from decades of devoted practice. Her fingers danced across the keys, and the old piano responded with a richness of tone that seemed impossible given its age and condition. The music filled the room, and Eleanor closed her eyes, and for a few precious minutes she was not a lonely old woman hiding in a beginner class. She was Eleni Vardakis again, the name she had performed under for 40 years. She was the young prodigy who had stunned audiences in Vienna, and the mature artist who had made grown men weep in Paris. She was the woman who had played duets with her husband on lazy Sunday mornings, and the widow who had played his memorial concerts with tears streaming down her face. Then she heard something, and her eyes snapped open. Through the window of the music room door she caught a glimpse of movement, and she stopped playing immediately. Her heart pounded as she strained to see if anyone was there, but the hallway appeared empty. She must have imagined it. Eleanor gathered her things with trembling hands and made her way out of the community center. She did not see Marcus standing in the shadows around the corner with a strange expression on his face. He had come back to retrieve his phone, which he had left on his desk, and he had heard something through the closed door that he could not explain as he stood there trying to make sense of what he had heard. Eleanor walked past the window, and he saw her shuffling along in her orthopedic shoes, looking for all the world like a harmless elderly beginner. It was impossible, he told himself. There was no way that music had come from her. He must have imagined it, or perhaps someone else had been in the room. Marcus retrieved his phone and left the building, but something nagged at him for the rest of the day. That night, as he lay in bed, he found himself humming the melody he had heard through the door, and he realized with a start that it was the opening bars of Chopin's Ballade No. 1, which was one of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire. He fell asleep telling himself it must have been a recording or a radio or anything other than the impossible truth. Mia Vance drove her small blue car through the quiet streets of the town where her grandmother had recently settled. The autumn trees were ablaze with color, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the road. She had made this drive every weekend since Eleanor moved here, and each time she felt a mixture of joy and worry. Joy because she loved her grandmother more than almost anyone in the world, and worry because she knew the secret that Eleanor was determined to keep hidden. Mia was 22 years old, with dark curly hair and her grandmother's intelligent eyes. She worked as a music journalist in the city, writing reviews of concerts and interviews with performers for a respected arts magazine. Music had been her passion since childhood, when she would sit on the floor of her grandmother's apartment in Vienna and listen to her practice for hours. Those memories were among the most precious things she owned. She pulled into the parking lot of Eleanor's modest apartment building and grabbed the bag of groceries she had brought. Her grandmother always insisted she did not need help, but Mia knew that Eleanor often forgot to buy proper food for herself. She climbed the stairs to the second floor and knocked on the door with the familiar rhythm they had used since Mia was a little girl. Eleanor opened the door with a warm smile and pulled Mia into a tight embrace. "My darling girl," she said, "you did not need to bring all of this." Mia stepped inside and looked around the small apartment. It was clean and tidy, but strangely empty. The walls were bare, and the shelves held only a few books and some simple decorations. There were no photographs anywhere, and certainly no framed concert programs or awards or any of the countless Mementos from Eleanor's extraordinary career. Grandmother, Mia said with a sigh. You have been here for over a month and you still have not unpacked properly. Where are all your things? Eleanor waved her hand dismissively and began putting away the groceries. They are in storage, she said. I did not see the need to bring all of that clutter into my new life. Mia sat down at the small kitchen table and watched her grandmother with concern. It is not clutter, she said gently. It is your history, your achievements. You performed for presidents and royalty. You sold out the greatest concert halls in the world. Why are you pretending none of that ever happened? Lena stopped what she was doing and stood very still for a long moment. When she turned to face Mia, her eyes held a sadness that seemed to go deeper than words could express. Because that woman does not exist anymore, she said quietly. Eleni Vardakis died 15 years ago, along with everything else that mattered. Mia felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She knew what her grandmother meant. 15 years ago, Eleanor's husband, Anton, had been killed in a car accident on a rainy night in Berlin. He had been a cellist of considerable talent, and he and Eleanor had been married for 35 years. Their love had been legendary in the classical music world, and their performances together had been described as conversations between two souls. After Anton's death, Eleanor had played one final concert, which was his memorial service. She had performed Schubert's Piano Sonata in B-flat major, which had been Anton's favorite piece, and those who were there said it was the most heartbreaking and beautiful performance they had ever witnessed. Then she had walked off the stage and never performed publicly again. The music world had searched for her for years. Journalists had written articles wondering what had become of the great Eleni Vardakis. Concert halls had offered her enormous sums to return. But Eleanor had disappeared completely, moving from city to city under her married name and avoiding anyone who might recognize her. Grandmother, Mia said carefully, I understand why you stopped performing, but do you really have to hide completely? You are taking a beginner piano class, for goodness sake. You are pretending you cannot play when you are one of the greatest pianists who ever lived. Eleanor sat down across from Mia and took her granddaughter's hands in her own. Her fingers were still strong and elegant despite her age, and Mia could feel the calluses that decades of practice had built up. You know why I stopped, she said. Every note I played reminded me of him. Every melody brought back memories that were too painful to bear. The music that had been my greatest joy became my greatest torment. But you are playing again, Mia pointed out. Why else would you join a piano class, even a beginner? When Eleanor smiled, and there was something almost shy in her expression. Because I felt the music calling me back, she admitted. These past few months I started hearing melodies in my head again. I would wake up in the middle of the night with my fingers moving as if they were playing invisible keys. I realized that I missed it desperately, but I was also terrified of it. So, you thought you would ease back in by pretending to be a beginner? Mia said with a mixture of understanding and exasperation. Eleanor nodded. I did not want pressure or recognition. I did not want people looking at me and expecting greatness. I just wanted to sit at a piano and feel the keys under my fingers without any of the weight that used to come with it. I wanted to rediscover why I fell in love with music in the first place before it became a career and a legacy and a birth. And Mia squeezed her grandmother's hands. And is it working? She asked. Sometimes, Eleanor said. There are moments when I am sitting at that old broken piano in the community center and everyone thinks I am just a foolish old woman learning my scales, and in those moments, I feel free. But there are other moments when holding back feels like torture. There is a teacher there named Marcus, and he is talented but arrogant, and sometimes I want so badly to show him what music really means. Mia laughed despite herself. I would pay good money to see the look on his face, she said. Lana laughed too, and for a moment, she looked younger and lighter. No, she said firmly. That is exactly what I am trying to avoid. The moment anyone discovers who I am, everything will change. The reporters will come and the concert halls will start calling again, and I will be Eleni Vardakis whether I want to be or not. Mia sobered and nodded slowly. I understand, she said, and I will keep your secret. But grandmother, I want you to know that I think you are wrong about one thing. You said that Eleni Vardakis died 15 years ago, but I do not believe that is true. She is still in there somewhere, and maybe this beginner class is her way of trying to come back. Kelena was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Perhaps, she said, but if she does come back, it has to be on her own terms. Not because someone discovered her or forced her out of hiding. It has to be her choice. They spent the rest of the afternoon together cooking dinner and talking about lighter things. Mia told stories about her work and the musicians she had interviewed, and Eleanor listened with genuine interest. They did not talk about the secret again, but it hung in the air between them like a third presence in the room. When Mia left that evening, she hugged her grandmother tightly and whispered, I love you no matter what. Whether you are Eleanor Vance or Eleni Vardakis or anyone else, you will always be my grandmother, and I will always be proud of you. Eleanor watched from her window as Mia's car pulled away, and she felt a warmth in her chest that she had not felt in many years. Perhaps she was not as alone as she had believed. Perhaps there was still room in her life for connection and love and even music. That night, she sat at the small electric keyboard she had bought secondhand, and she played quietly with the volume turned low. She played the songs that Anton had loved, and this time, instead of only pain, she also felt gratitude. Gratitude for the years they had shared, and the music they had made together, and the love that still lived on in her memory. Show did not know that in a vintage record shop downtown there was a dusty vinyl album with her face on the cover. She did not know that her carefully constructed anonymity was about to come under threat. All she knew was that for the first time in 15 years she was beginning to feel like herself again. And that feeling was both terrifying and wonderful. Marcus Chen stood in front of the bathroom mirror in his small apartment and practiced his smile. It was the smile he would use when the talent scout came to the community center fundraiser in 2 months. The smile that said that was humble and grateful while also conveying that he was destined for greater things than teaching beginners. In a rundown community center he had received the news 3 days ago, and it had transformed his entire outlook on life. A representative from the Morrison Arts Foundation would be attending the charity fundraiser, and Marcus knew this was his chance. The Morrison Foundation sponsored promising classical musicians and gave them opportunities to perform with major orchestras. If he could impress this scout with his performance, everything could change. Marcus thought about the past 10 years of his life and felt the familiar burn of frustration and resentment. He had been the golden boy once. At 24, he had won the prestigious Whitmore piano competition, and everyone had said he was going to be a star. Agents had called and concert halls had expressed interest, and the future had seemed limitless. Then everything had fallen apart. A bad review from an influential critic had started the decline. Then a disastrous audition where his nerves had betrayed him had cemented his reputation as someone who could not handle pressure. The calls had stopped coming and the opportunities had dried up, and Marcus had found himself teaching beginner piano classes to pay his rent. But this fundraiser would be different. He was older now and more experienced, and he had been practicing obsessively for weeks. He had chosen to perform Chopin's Ballade No. 1, which was one of the most challenging and impressive pieces in the piano repertoire. It was a bold choice, but Marcus believed boldness was exactly what he needed to show the scout that he was still a force to be reckoned with. He arrived at the community center that morning with a new energy in his step. The beginner class was waiting for him, and for once he did not feel annoyed by their presence. He saw them as a necessary stepping stone, and their admiration of his skills as validation that he still had what it took. "Good morning, everyone," he said with unusual warmth. "I have an exciting announcement. In 2 months, our community center will be hosting a charity fundraiser, and each of our classes will have the opportunity to perform." The students exchanged nervous glances. Frank raised his hand tentatively and asked what they would be expected to play. Marcus smiled reassuringly. "Something simple," he said. "A group piece that will show the audience how far you have come. And at the end of the evening I will perform a solo piece as the finale." He could not help the pride that crept into his voice when he mentioned his solo, and he noticed that most of the students seemed impressed. All except Eleanor, who sat quietly at her old upright piano with an expression that was difficult to read. There was something in her eyes that made Marcus uncomfortable, though he could not have said exactly what it was. For the next several weeks, Marcus threw himself into preparation with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He practiced his Chopin piece for hours every day until his fingers ached and his back was stiff. At night he listened to recordings of famous pianists performing the same piece, and he analyzed every phrase and every dynamic marking. His teaching suffered as a result. He became increasingly impatient with his students, and his criticisms grew harsher. When Frank stumbled over a simple scale, Marcus snapped at him with unnecessary cruelty. When Doris asked a question about rhythm, Marcus sighed so loudly that she blushed with embarrassment. Eleanor watched all of this with quiet concern. She recognized the signs of a musician who was letting ambition poison his love of music. She had seen it happen to many talented performers over the years, and it rarely ended well. The pressure to succeed could destroy the very passion that had made someone want to play in the first place. One afternoon during a break in the lesson, Marcus sat at his keyboard and began running through a difficult passage from the Chopin piece. His fingers flew across the keys with technical precision, but there was something mechanical about his playing. It was impressive, but not moving. Alana listened and found herself humming along with the melody. The Ballade No. 1 had always been one of her favorite pieces, and she knew every note by heart. She had performed it dozens of times in her career, and each time she had found new depths of emotion in its soaring phrases and thundering climaxes. Marcus stopped playing abruptly and turned to look at her. "You were humming," he said with surprise in his voice. Eleanor felt her heart skip. She had not realized she was doing it. "Oh dear," she said quickly. "Was that wrong? I must have heard that song somewhere before." Marcus stared at her for a long moment, and something flickered in his eyes that might have been suspicion. "That is not a song," he said. "It is Chopin's Ballade No. 1, and it is one of the most complex pieces in the classical repertoire." "Where would you have heard it?" Eleanor shrugged with practiced innocence. "Perhaps on the radio," she suggested, "or in a movie. These old ears do not always remember where things come from." Marcus seemed unconvinced, but he let the matter drop and returned to his practice. Eleanor exhaled slowly and reminded herself to be more careful. It was becoming harder and harder to maintain her disguise, and she was making small mistakes that could give her away. After class ended that day, Marcus asked the students to stay for a moment. He explained that he wanted to assess each of them individually to determine what role they would play in the group performance. He went down the line asking each student to play a simple piece while he made notes on a clipboard. When he reached Eleanor, he handed her a sheet of music that was slightly more complex than what he had given the others. Try this one, he said with a challenging look in his eyes. I want to see how much you have learned. And Eleanor looked at the sheet music and recognized it immediately as a simplified arrangement of a Mozart sonata. It was well within her abilities, and in fact she had performed the full version hundreds of times. But she could not let Marcus know that she placed the music on the stand and began to play. Every instinct told her to let the music flow naturally, but she forced herself to hesitate on the difficult parts. She stumbled over a run of 6 notes that she could have played in her sleep, and she missed a dynamic, marking that she had deliberately ignored. Listened with his arms crossed, and when she finished he shook his head. Your timing is off, and you are not paying attention to the dynamics, he said, but I suppose that is to be expected. You will play the simplest part in the group performance, and I suggest you practice it every day until it becomes automatic. Thank you, Eleanor said. I will do my best. As she gathered her things to leave, Marcus called out to her. That song you were humming earlier, he said. You really do not remember where you heard it? Eleanor paused at the door and turned back to face him. I am sorry, she said with a smile. At my age the memory is not what it used to be. Perhaps it will come to me later. She walked out into the hallway and felt Marcus's eyes following her. He was suspicious now, and she knew she would have to be even more careful in the weeks ahead. But part of her wondered if perhaps being discovered would not be such a terrible thing. The weight of her secret was growing heavier every day, and there were moments when she wanted nothing more than to sit down at the piano and show them all what she could really do. She pushed that thought aside and walked out into the autumn sunshine. The fundraiser was 2 months away, and until then she would continue to play her part. The quiet beginner in the corner who could barely find middle C, and who had no business humming along to Chop and Butt somewhere. Deep inside her the music was stirring, and it was becoming harder and harder to keep it contained. Eleanor knew that something was going to have to give eventually, and she could only hope that when it did she would be ready for whatever came next. The morning of the incident began like any other Tuesday at the Hartwell Community Center. The autumn sun streamed through the windows of the music room, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted in from the hallway. The beginner piano students took their usual seats and waited for Marcus to begin the lesson, sat at her familiar upright piano and exchanged pleasantries with Doris, who had become something of a friend over the past weeks. They talked about the weather and their grandchildren and a new bakery that had opened downtown. It was comfortable and ordinary, and Eleanor had almost forgotten that she was living a double life. Harold Pemberton sat at his keyboard near the front of the room, and he was not his usual self. Harold was 70 years old with a gentle face and kind eyes, and he had joined the piano class to fulfill a promise he had made to his late wife. She had passed away 2 years ago after a long illness, and during her final weeks she had asked him to learn to play their favorite song so that she could hear it one more time. He had not been able to learn it in time, and the guilt had haunted him. Ever since today, Harold's hands were trembling slightly and his face was pale. He had been dreading this lesson because Marcus had assigned him a piece that happened to be the very song his wife had loved. It was a simple arrangement of an old love ballad, and hearing the melody again had brought back a flood of memories that he was not prepared to handle. Arrived and began the lesson with his usual brisk efficiency. He talked about proper fingering technique and the importance of practicing with a metronome. His words washed over Harold without registering as the old man stared at the sheet music in front of him with growing dread now. Let us practice the piece I assigned last week, Marcus said. Everyone began from the top of the room, filled with the sound of keyboards as the students began to play. Harold's fingers found the first few notes, and immediately the memories crashed over him like a wave. He saw his wife's face and heard her laugh and felt her hand in his. He remembered the way she used to hum this song while cooking dinner, and the way she had cried when he promised to learn it for her. His breathing became shallow and his vision blurred. The room seemed to spin around him, and he could not catch his breath. His hands froze above the keys, and a sound escaped his throat that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Harold, Doris called out with alarm in her voice. Are you all right? Everyone stopped playing and turned to look at Harold, who was now gripping the edge of his keyboard with white knuckles. His chest heaved and tears streamed down his face, and he seemed to be looking at something that no one else could. See, I cannot, Marcus said uncertainly. He took a step toward Harold and then stopped as if unsure what to do. Someone should call for help. The other students shifted nervously in their seats. Frank pulled out his phone and started dialing, but Eleanor was already moving. She rose from her bench and crossed the room with a quiet purpose that seemed at odds with her usual demeanor. She knelt down beside Harold and placed her hand gently on his arm. Harold, she said softly, can you hear me? You are having a panic attack and it will pass. I need you to breathe with me. Harold's wild eyes found her face, and he latched onto her presence, like a drowning man grabbing a life preserver. Eleanor began counting slowly and breathing in an exaggerated rhythm that Harold instinctively tried to match. The other students watched in silence as she talked him through the worst of it with the calm expertise of someone who had done this before. After several minutes, Harold's breathing began to slow and his grip on the keyboard loosened. I am sorry, he whispered. The song made me think of my wife, and I just do not need to explain, Eleanor said gently. Grief has its own timeline, and music has a way of bringing it to the surface. She helped Harold to a chair against the wall and made sure he had water to drink. Then she turned to face the rest of the room and her expression changed. There was something in her eyes that had not been there before, and Marcus felt a chill run down his spine, though he could not have said why. Music can heal, Eleanor said quietly, but it can also wound if we forget why we are playing. She walked back to her old upright piano and sat down on the bench. Without asking permission, she placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The melody that emerged was not the simple love ballad they had been practicing. It was something else entirely. Something that seemed to be improvised in the moment, and yet felt ancient and inevitable. The notes were gentle at first, and then they swelled with an aching tenderness that made Doris catch her breath. The music spoke of loss and longing and love that transcended death. It was beautiful and heartbreaking, and it filled the room with an almost physical presence. Harold lifted his head and listened with tears still wet on his cheeks. But these were different tears. These were tears of release rather than anguish. The music seemed to be acknowledging his pain while also offering comfort. It did not try to fix anything or make things better. It simply sat with him in his grief and told him that he was not alone. Eleanor played for 3 minutes that felt like hours. Her fingers moved across the keys with an effortless grace that was impossible to reconcile with the fumbling. The beginner they had all come to know, the old upright piano which had seemed incapable of producing anything beautiful, suddenly sang under her touch as if it had been waiting for this. The moment all along, when the final note faded into silence, no one moved. The room was utterly still except for the sound of Harold quietly weeping. But his face was peaceful now, and when he looked at Eleanor there was gratitude in his eyes that went beyond words. "Thank you," he said. Simply. Eleanor nodded and then seemed to catch herself. She looked around at the stunned faces of her classmates and something like panic flickered across her features. "Oh dear," she said in a voice that was not quite steady. "I am so sorry. I did not mean to show off like that. I do not know what came over me." Doris was the first to find her voice. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she asked with wonder. Eleanor stood up from the piano and smoothed down her cardigan with trembling hands. "I suppose I remembered something from long ago," she said vaguely. "I used to play a little when I was younger. The music just came back to me in the moment." Marcus stood frozen in place and his mind was racing. What he had just witnessed was not the playing of someone who used to play a little. It was the playing of a master. The technique had been flawless and the emotional depth had been profound, and the improvisation had shown a level of musicality that most professionals never achieved. He opened his mouth to say something, but Eleanor was already gathering her things. "I think I should go," she said. "Harold is feeling better now, and I seem to have disrupted the lesson. Please forgive." Mesh hurried out of the room before anyone could stop her, and the door swung shut behind her with a soft click. The students looked at each other in bewilderment, and Harold stared at the door, through which she had vanished, with an expression of awe. Marcus remained silent, but his mind was churning. He thought about the Chopin melody he had heard her humming in the strange way she sometimes seemed to catch herself in the middle of a lesson. He thought about the way her fingers had moved across the keys with the unconscious precision of someone who had spent decades at the instrument. He did not say anything to the other students, but as he dismissed the class early and packed up his things, a new determination was forming in his mind. Eleanor Vance was hiding something, and he was going to find out what it was. His pride demanded it, and his curiosity would not let it rest. The old woman in the corner was not who she pretended to be, and Marcus was going to prove it one way or another. Marcus Chen could not stop thinking about what he had witnessed in the music room. The image of Eleanor's hands moving across the keys played on repeat in his mind, and it kept him awake at night. He had studied piano his entire life, and he knew the difference between someone who had taken a few lessons and someone who had dedicated decades to the craft. What Eleanor had done that day was not possible for an amateur. It was simply not possible. He began his investigation quietly at first. After the next class, he lingered near the door and waited for Eleanor to pass. "Mrs. Vance," he said with a casual tone that he did not feel. "That was quite a performance the other day. Where did you say you learned to play?" Eleanor smiled pleasantly and adjusted her cardigan. "Oh, I took some lessons when I was young," she said. "I suppose muscle memory is a funny thing. It just came back to me in the moment." Marcus nodded, but he was not satisfied. "What kind of lessons?" he pressed. "And where did you take them?" Eleanor's smile did not waver, but something shifted behind her eyes. "That was a long time ago," she said. "I cannot remember the details. My memory is not what it used to be. Now, if you will excuse me, I have some errands to run." She walked away before he could ask any more questions, and Marcus watched her go with narrowed eyes. Her story did not add up. No amount of childhood lessons could explain what he had heard. The improvisation alone had shown a level of harmonic sophistication that took years to develop. Over the next few days, Marcus tried different approaches. He assigned Eleanor increasingly difficult exercises and watched carefully for any sign that she was holding back. He asked her to sight read a complex piece and noted how her eyes moved across the page with a speed that suggested she was very familiar with musical notation. Each time she made small deliberate mistakes, and each time Marcus became more convinced that those mistakes were intentional. The other students noticed his increased attention to Eleanor, and some of them found it odd. Doris remarked that Marcus seemed to have taken a special interest in their oldest classmate, and Frank wondered aloud if perhaps Marcus was being a bit too hard on her. But no one suspected the real reason for his scrutiny. One afternoon, Marcus caught Eleanor alone in the music room during her usual after-class practice time. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment before announcing his presence. She was playing scales very slowly and very badly, and yet there was something about the way she held her hands that looked wrong. Or rather, it looked right in a way that beginners never managed. "You stay late almost every day," Marcus observed as he walked into the room. "That is dedication." Eleanor looked up with a mild expression. "I find practicing relaxing," she said, "and I want to be ready for the group performance at the fundraiser." Marcus sat down at his own keyboard and studied her face. "I have been thinking about what you did for Harold," he said. "That was very kind. And the music you played was extraordinary." "It was nothing," Eleanor said quickly. "I surprised myself, honestly." Marcus leaned forward with intensity in his gaze. "Who are you really?" he asked. "And please do not insult my intelligence by pretending you do not know what I mean. No one who plays like that is a beginner." No one. Eleanor was silent for a long moment, and Marcus could see a war taking place behind her eyes. For just an instant he thought she might tell him the truth, but then her expression settled back into pleasant neutrality. "I am just an old woman who enjoys piano," she said firmly. "Whatever you think you heard that day, you were mistaken. Now, if you will excuse me, I really must get back to my scales." Marcus knew he had pushed too far, and he backed off for the time being. But his investigation was far from over. That evening he sat at his computer and began searching for any information he could find about Eleanor Vance. He tried different combinations of her name with words like piano and musician and concert, but nothing useful came up. There were too many Eleanor Vances in the world, and none of them seemed to be hiding a secret. Musical past. He tried searching for famous pianists who had disappeared from public life, and he found a few interesting stories, but none that seemed to match his elderly student. He searched for retired musicians in the area, and for piano prodigies who had given up their careers. Nothing fit. The next week, Marcus decided to try a different approach. During a break in the lesson, he overheard Eleanor talking to Doris about her granddaughter, who was coming to visit that weekend. "My Mia works in the city," Eleanor said with obvious pride. "She is a music journalist." Marcus filed this information away, and after class he walked past Eleanor just as a young woman with dark curly hair was entering the building. The young woman smiled at Eleanor and called out grandmother, and Marcus noted how much they looked alike. He watched from a distance as they embraced and walked out together. Then he pulled out his phone and searched for music journalists named Mia. It took some time, but eventually he found a Mia Vance who wrote for an arts magazine in the city. Her photo matched the woman he had seen, and her biography mentioned that she had grown up in Europe. Before moving to the United States, Marcus felt a surge of excitement. If Eleanor's granddaughter had grown up in Europe, then Eleanor must have lived there too. This was a new lead to follow. He spent the rest of the evening reading Mia's articles and looking for any clues about her family. But Mia was careful, and she never mentioned her grandmother by name or gave any details about her background. Frustrated but not defeated, Marcus expanded his search to European musicians and piano legends and women who had retired from performance. The results were overwhelming, and he had no way to narrow them down without more information. He fell asleep at his computer that night with dozens of browser tabs open and dreams filled with piano music and mysterious old women. The next morning he woke with renewed determination. He might not be able to find Eleanor in a database, but there were other ways to uncover the truth. He would watch her more carefully, and he would push her with more challenging assignments. Sooner or later she would make a mistake and her facade would crack. And when it did, Marcus would be there to see it. What he did not realize was that the answer he was looking for was closer than he imagined. A dusty vinyl record sat in a shop just a few blocks from the community center, and on its cover was a photograph that would change everything. But Marcus had not found it yet, and until he did, Eleanor's secret remained safe for now at least. The old woman in the corner continued to play her scales and fumble over her exercises, and if sometimes her fingers moved with a little too much precision or her ear caught a wrong note a fraction of a second too fast, she always managed to cover it up before anyone noticed. She had spent 15 years hiding from the world, and she was not about to be discovered by an arrogant young teacher with something to prove. At least that is what she told herself as she lay awake at night, wondering how much longer she could keep pretending to be someone she was not. The vintage record shop occupied a narrow storefront between a dry cleaner and a sandwich shop on the main street of town. It had opened just 2 weeks ago, and Marcus had been meaning to stop in ever since he noticed the hand-painted sign that read Vinyl Paradise. He was a collector of classical recordings, and he was always looking for rare performances that might teach him something new. The shop was cramped and dusty and smelled of old paper and forgotten things. Wooden crates overflowed with albums organized by genre and era, and the walls were lined with shelves that reached all the way to the ceiling. A middle-aged man with a gray ponytail sat behind the counter reading a book about jazz and nodded at Marcus as he entered. "Take your time," the man said. "The classical section is in the back." Marcus made his way through the narrow aisles and found himself standing before 3 crates marked classical and orchestral. He began flipping through the albums with practiced efficiency, checking the spines for familiar names and stopping occasionally to examine a particularly interesting cover. Was about to give up and leave when his fingers landed on an album that made him stop breathing. The cover showed a young woman seated at a grand piano, and she was looking directly at the camera with eyes that Marcus recognized instantly. They were Eleanor's eyes, the same intelligent depths and the same hint of hidden sadness and the same unmistakable shade of green. The album title read, Eleni Vardakis performs Rachmaninoff with the Vienna Philharmonic, and the year printed at the bottom was 1987. Marcus stared at the photograph and his mind refused to accept what he was seeing. The woman on the cover was beautiful and young with dark hair pulled back in an elegant style, but the eyes were exactly the same. There was no mistaking them. His hands trembled as he carried the album to the counter. "How much for this one?" he asked in a voice that did not sound like his own. The shop owner glanced at the album and raised his eyebrows. "Ah, Eleni Vardakis," he said with appreciation. "Now that is a find. She was one of the greatest pianists of the 20th century, you know. Disappeared from public life about 15 years ago and no one knows what happened to her. I would say this one is worth about $40. Marcus paid without haggling and left the shop with the album tucked under his arm. He walked to his car and sat in the driver's seat and stared at the cover for a long time. Then he pulled out his phone and began to search. The results came flooding in and each one confirmed what he already knew. Eleni Vardakis had been born in Greece and began playing piano at the age of 4. By 12 she was performing with major orchestras, and by 20 she was considered one of the finest pianists of her generation. Her career had spanned 4 decades and she had performed in every major concert hall in the world. Critics had called her playing transcendent and audiences had wept at her performances. She had married a cellist named Anton Vardakis, and their musical partnership had been legendary. They had recorded dozens of albums together and their live performances had been described as conversations between two souls. By all accounts they had been deeply in love. Then tragedy had struck. In 2009, Anton had been killed in a car accident while driving home from a rehearsal in Berlin. The news had devastated the classical music world and everyone had wondered how Eleni would cope with such a loss. She had played one final concert at his memorial service. Witnesses said it was the most heartbreaking performance they had ever heard. She had played Schubert's Piano Sonata in B-flat major, which had been Anton's favorite piece, and when she finished she had walked off the stage without a word. She had not performed publicly since the music world had searched for her for years. Journalists had written articles wondering where she had gone. Concert halls had offered her enormous sums to return, but Eleni Vardakis had vanished completely and no one had been able to find her until now. Marcus sat in his car and felt the full weight of what he had discovered. The elderly woman in his beginner piano class who fumbled over scales and could not seem to find middle C was actually one of the greatest pianists who had ever lived. He had been condescending to a legend and he had been too blind to see. I'd felt a rush of shame as he remembered all the times he had corrected her hand, position or side at her mistakes. He had been so certain of his own superiority that he had never considered she might be hiding something extraordinary. The irony was almost painful. He who had been so desperate for recognition had been teaching someone whose recognition far exceeded anything he could ever hope to achieve. But along with the shame came a burning curiosity. Why was she hiding? Why would someone of her talent and fame choose to pretend to be a beginner? What had happened to make her give up everything she had worked for? Marcus drove home in a daze and spent the rest of the evening researching everything he could find about Eleni Vardakis. He read interviews from decades past where she spoke about her love of music with a passion that was almost spiritual. He watched grainy videos of her performances and marveled at the way her fingers seemed to dance across the keys. He listened to her recordings and heard in them the same emotional depth that he had witnessed when she played for Harold. By midnight he had a complete picture of who Eleanor Vance really was. He understood now why she had hummed the Chopin ballade so perfectly and why she had been able to improvise that extraordinary piece for Harold. He understood why she sometimes looked at him with an expression that seemed to hold pity and why she always held back, just enough to maintain her disguise. What he did not understand was what to do with this knowledge. Part of him wanted to confront her immediately and demand an explanation. Part of him wanted to tell everyone and watch their jaws drop when they learned the truth. But a smaller, quieter part of him recognized that she had chosen to hide for a reason, and that exposing her might cause more harm than good. Marcus lay in bed that night and stared at the ceiling and thought about his own career. He had spent 10 years nursing his wounded pride and blaming others for his failures. He had convinced himself that he was better than everyone around him and that teaching beginners was beneath him. But Eleanor had been at the very top of her profession and she had chosen to walk away from it all. She had found something more important than fame and recognition, and Marcus was only beginning to understand what that might be. He fell asleep with the vinyl album on his nightstand and dreamed of music. In his dream, Eleanor was playing the piano on a great stage and the audience was weeping with the beauty of it. And Marcus was sitting in the front row, not performing or competing but simply listening. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt at peace. 3 days passed before Marcus worked up the courage to approach Eleanor. He spent those days in a state of distraction that the other students noticed. His teaching became unfocused, and his criticisms lost their usual sharpness. Frank commented that Marcus seemed like he was thinking about something else, and Doris wondered aloud if he was feeling unwell. Eleanor noticed the change as well. She caught Marcus looking at her several times with an expression that was different from his usual impatience. There was something softer in his gaze and something that looked almost like reverence. She felt a knot of anxiety forming in her stomach because she recognized that look. It was the look people got when they knew who she really was. After class on Thursday, Marcus asked Eleanor if she would stay behind for a few minutes. The other students filed out and soon they were alone in the music room with only the hum of the heating system for company. Eleanor sat at her upright piano and waited with a calm she did not feel. Marcus did not sit down. He stood by the window with his hands clasped behind his back and stared out at the parking lot. For a long moment neither of them spoke. "I found something," Marcus said finally. His voice was quiet and uncertain, which was unlike him. "I found a record in a vintage shop downtown. It was a recording from 1987 of someone performing Rachmaninoff with the Vienna Philharmonic." Eleanor felt her heart drop, but she kept her expression neutral. "That sounds lovely," she said. "The woman on the cover," Marcus continued. "She has your eyes. Exactly your eyes. I noticed it immediately." Elena said nothing. She waited for him to continue because she knew there was no point in trying to deny it. "Now I spent 3 days researching," Marcus said, and he finally turned to face her. "I read every article and watched every video I could find. Eleni Vardakis, they called you the poet of the piano. Critics said your interpretations were unmatched in emotional depth. You performed for presidents and queens and sold out concert halls across the world." The name hung in the air between them like something fragile and dangerous. Eleanor looked at her hands, which were folded in her lap, and she felt the weight of 15 years of hiding begin to shift. "Why?" Marcus asked, and his voice cracked slightly. "Why are you here pretending to be a beginner? Why are you letting me teach you scales when you are one of the greatest pianists who ever lived?" Lena was quiet for a long time. She looked at the young man before her and saw the confusion and hurt in his eyes. She owed him an explanation, even if it was one she had never wanted to give. "Please sit down," she said at last. "This is not a short story." Marcus pulled up a chair and sat across from her, and Eleanor took a deep breath. She told him about Anton and how they had met as students at a conservatory in Vienna. She told him about their marriage and their 35 years of making music together. She told him about the accident on that rainy night in Berlin and the phone call that had shattered her world when he died, she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "The music died with him. Every note I played reminded me of him. Every melody brought back memories that were too painful to bear. The piano had been my greatest love, and suddenly it felt like my greatest enemy." She told him about the memorial concert and how she had played Schubert's sonata with tears streaming down her face. She told him how she had walked off the stage and known that she would never perform publicly again. She told him about the years of wandering from city to city and avoiding anyone who might recognize her. "He thought I would never play again," she said. "I thought that part of my life was over forever. But a few months ago, something changed. I started hearing music in my head again. I would wake up in the middle of the night with my fingers moving as if they were playing invisible keys. The music was calling me back." Marcus listened in silence, and his earlier arrogance had vanished completely. In its place was something like understanding. "I did not want pressure or recognition," she continued. "I did not want people looking at me and expecting greatness. I just wanted to sit at a piano and feel the keys under my fingers without any of the weight that used to come with it. I wanted to rediscover why I fell in love with music in the first place, before it became a career and a legacy and a burden." Marcus nodded slowly. "That is why you joined the beginner class," he said. "You were trying to start over." Eleanor smiled, and there was sadness in it. "I was trying to find joy again, and in some ways I have. When I sit at that old piano and everyone thinks I am just a foolish old woman learning my scales, I feel free in a way I have not felt in decades. There is no pressure and no expectation. Just the music itself." Marcus looked down at his hands, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I have spent the past 10 years feeling sorry for myself," he said. "I had one bad break and I let it define my entire life. I convinced myself that teaching beginners was beneath me and that I deserved better. But you were at the very top and you chose to walk away. You found something more important than fame. You have talent, Marcus," Eleanor said gently. "I have heard you practice your Chopin and you play it beautifully, but you have forgotten why any of us play. It is not for scouts or applause or recognition. It is for the music itself. When you play only for others, you lose the connection to why you started in the first place." Marcus was quiet, and Eleanor could see that her words had struck deep. He was thinking about his obsession with the talent scout and his desperate need for validation. He was thinking about how hollow his playing had become even as his technique improved. "What will you do now?" he asked finally. "Now that I know." Eleanor considered the question carefully. "That depends," she said. "Will you keep my secret?" Marcus met her eyes, and something passed between them that was almost like respect. "Of course," he said. "I will not tell anyone. But may I ask why you chose to hide it all? People would be overjoyed to know you were still alive and still playing." Lena shook her head. "If I am discovered, everything will change. The reporters will come and the concert halls will start calling, and I will be Eleni Vardakis, whether I want to be or not. I have made peace with who I was, but I am not ready to become her again. Perhaps I never will be." They sat in silence for a while, and the afternoon light slanted through the windows and painted golden stripes across the floor. Finally Marcus stood and extended his hand. "Thank you for telling me," he said. I know it was not easy. Eleanor took his hand and was surprised by the gentleness of his grip. Thank you for listening, she said. And Marcus, please do not feel sorry for yourself anymore. You still have so much music ahead of you. Marcus nodded, and there were tears in his eyes, though he would not let them fall. He gathered his things and walked to the door, but before he left he turned back one more time. The fundraiser is in 3 weeks, he said. I want you to know that whatever happens, I am going to play differently now. I am going to try to remember why I started. Eleanor smiled, and for the first time since she had arrived in this town she felt like she might not be so alone after all. Something had shifted between them, and she knew that things would never be quite the same. Her secret was still safe, but now she shared it with someone who might actually understand it. That was both terrifying and wonderful. The night of the charity fundraiser arrived with a cold snap that sent frost creeping across the windows of the Hartwell Community Center. Inside the building, the main hall had been transformed. Rows of folding chairs faced a small stage where a gleaming grand piano sat beneath warm spotlights. The walls were decorated with streamers and banners, and a long table near the entrance was covered with donated items for the silent auction. Eleanor stood in the back of the hall, watching people file in and take their seats. She wore a simple navy dress that Mia had helped her choose, and her silver hair was pinned back in an elegant style. Her granddaughter stood beside her with a nervous expression. Are you sure about this? Mia whispered. You could still leave before anyone sees you. Eleanor shook her head. I promised the class I would be here for our group performance, she said. I cannot abandon them now. Besides, I want to see how Marcus does. He has been practicing so hard. Mia squeezed her grandmother's hand, and they found seats near the back where Eleanor could observe without drawing attention to herself. The hall filled quickly with community members and families and a few local journalists who had come to cover the event. Eleanor noticed a well-dressed man in the front row who carried himself with the air of someone important. She guessed he was the talent scout from the Morrison Foundation that Marcus had mentioned. The evening began with a welcome speech from the community center director, and then the performances started. A children's choir sang 2 songs with enthusiastic imperfection. A group of senior citizens performed a line dancing routine that drew appreciative applause. A teenage girl played a violin solo that showed genuine promise. Then it was time for the beginner piano class to take the stage. Eleanor rose from her seat and made her way to the front, where Frank and Doris and Harold and Timothy were already gathering. They arranged themselves at a row of electronic keyboards that had been set up behind the grand piano, and Eleanor took her place at the end of the row. The piece they had prepared was a simple arrangement of a popular melody that allowed each student to play a different part. Marcus stood to the side and gave them a nod of encouragement. He looked pale and distracted, and Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders. She knew he was thinking about his solo performance, which would close the evening. The class began to play, and despite their nervousness, they managed to get through the piece without any major disasters. Frank came in a beat early at one point, and Doris hit a wrong note during the bridge, but overall the performance was charming, and the audience applauded warmly when they finished. Harold caught Eleanor's eye and smiled, and she knew that the music had helped him heal in some small way. The students left the stage and returned to their seats, and then it was time for the finale. Marcus walked to the grand piano and sat down on the bench. The room fell silent, and Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Marcus placed his hands on the keys and began to play Chopin's Ballade No. 1. The opening notes were beautiful and his technique was flawless as always, but Eleanor noticed something wrong almost immediately. His hands were trembling and his breathing was shallow, and there was a tightness in his shoulders that would only get worse as the piece progressed. The ballad was demanding, even under the best circumstances, and Marcus was clearly struggling under the pressure. He made it through the first section, but his timing began to slip during the lyrical passage that followed. The notes came out mechanical and rushed, and the emotional depth that the piece required was nowhere to be found. Eleanor watched as the color drained from his face. She saw his eyes flick toward the talent scout in the front row, and she saw the panic that was building behind his careful facade. He was thinking too much and feeling too little, and the music was suffering for it. Then it happened. During a technically challenging run, Marcus's fingers stumbled and he hit a wrong note. He tried to recover, but the mistake had shattered his concentration. His hands froze above the keys and he sat perfectly still as if he had forgotten how to move. The silence stretched on for several agonizing seconds, and the audience began to murmur with concern. Eleanor felt something shift inside her. She looked at Marcus and saw a young man whose dreams were crumbling before his eyes. She saw herself as she had been decades ago when fear and doubt had threatened to consume her. She saw Anton's face in her memory and heard his voice telling her that music was meant to be shared. Before she knew what she was doing, she was on her feet. She walked down the aisle toward the stage, and the audience parted to let her pass. Mia called out in alarm, but Eleanor did not stop. She climbed the steps to the stage and crossed to the piano where Marcus sat frozen with devastation on his face. Eleanor sat down on the bench beside him and placed her hands on the bass keys. Marcus looked at her with shock and confusion, and something that might have been hope together. She whispered so softly that only he could hear. Then she began to play. Her left hand picked up the accompaniment where Marcus had faltered, and the notes rang out clear and true. For a moment Marcus just stared at her as if he could not believe what was happening. Then slowly his right hand began to move and he joined her with the melody. They played together and the music transformed. What had been mechanical and frightened became alive and breathing. Eleanor's left hand supported his right, and they found a rhythm together that neither of them could have achieved alone. The Chopin ballade swelled and soared, and the audience sat in stunned silence. Marcus's trembling stopped and his face relaxed. He was no longer playing for the talent scout or for recognition or for his wounded pride. He was playing with Eleanor, and for the first time in years he remembered why he had fallen in love with music. It was not about perfection or competition. It was about connection and expression and the simple joy of creating something beautiful. The piece built to its thundering climax, and Eleanor's hands flew across the keys with the power and precision of the master she had been. Marcus matched her intensity, and together they brought the ballade to its final crashing chords. The last note faded into silence, and for a long moment no one moved. Then the audience erupted. People rose to their feet and applause filled the hall like a wave. Someone was shouting and someone else was crying, and the standing ovation went on and on. Mia stood in the back with tears streaming down her face and her hands pressed over her mouth. Marcus turned to Eleanor, and there were tears in his eyes as well. "Thank you," he said, and his voice broke on the words. Eleanor smiled at him, and she realized that for the first time in 15 years she did not feel like she was hiding. The music had brought her back, and it felt like coming home. Whatever happened next, she knew that she had done the right thing. She had helped a young man find his way, and in doing so she had found something of herself that she thought was lost forever. The applause continued, and Eleanor sat at the piano with her hands resting on the keys and knew that everything was about to change. Her secret would not survive this night, but somehow that did not frighten her anymore. She was ready to face whatever came next. And in the front row, the talent scout from the Morrison Foundation sat with his mouth hanging open because he had just witnessed something extraordinary, and he had no idea that the real surprise was still to come. The applause seemed to go on forever. Eleanor sat at the grand piano and felt the sound washing over her like a tide. Beside her, Marcus remained motionless, with tears still wet on his cheeks and an expression of wonder on his face. The audience was on its feet, and the sound of clapping hands filled the hall with a warmth that Eleanor had not felt in 15 years. She looked out at the sea of faces, and for a moment she felt disoriented. It was so similar to the countless ovations she had received during her career, and yet it was completely different. These were not sophisticated concertgoers in evening wear. These were ordinary people from a small town who had come to support their community center, and somehow that made their appreciation even more meaningful. Then a voice cut through the applause, and everything changed. "That is Eleni Vardakis," someone shouted from the middle of the audience. The voice belonged to an elderly man with white hair and glasses who was pointing at Eleanor with a trembling hand. "I saw her perform in Vienna in 1985. I would recognize those hands anywhere. That is Eleni Vardakis." The applause faltered, and a murmur rippled through the crowd. People began turning to each other and whispering, and the name Eleni Vardakis spread through the hall like wildfire. Eleanor felt her heart pounding, and her first instinct was to flee. But something held her in place, and she realized that she was tired of running. That elderly man was making his way toward the stage, and others were following him. Someone pulled out a phone and began taking pictures. A journalist in the back of the room was already typing furiously on a laptop. Mia pushed through the crowd and reached the edge of the stage with panic in her eyes. "Grandmother," she called. "We need to get you out of here." But Eleanor shook her head and rose from the piano bench. She walked to the front of the stage and looked out at the audience, and something in her expression made them fall silent. The whispers stopped and the cameras paused, and everyone waited to hear what she would say. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "My name is Eleanor Vance," she said, and her voice carried across the hall with the same power that had once filled concert halls around the world. "But many years ago I performed under a different name. I was known as Eleni Vardakis." A gasp went through the audience and the murmuring started again, but Eleanor raised her hand and they quieted. "15 years ago I lost my husband Anton," she continued. "He was not just my partner in music, but my partner in everything. When he died, the music died with him, and I could not bear to play anymore. I walked away from my career, and I spent years trying to outrun my grief. I changed my name and I hid from everyone who knew me. I thought that if I could just be ordinary, I might find some peace." She paused and looked at Marcus, who was watching her with an expression of deep understanding. "I came to this town to be near my granddaughter and to try to reconnect with the music that I had abandoned," she said. "I joined the beginner piano class because I wanted to start over. I wanted to rediscover why I fell in love with playing in the first place. I did not want anyone to know who I was because I was afraid that the pressure would crush me all over." Again, the audience was utterly silent now, and Eleanor could see tears on several faces. Even the journalist had stopped typing and was listening with rapt attention tonight. "I watched a young man freeze on this stage because he had forgotten why music matters," she said. "He was so worried about impressing a talent scout that he lost his connection to the music itself. And I realized that I could not sit by and watch that happen. So I did something I never thought I would do again. I played." She turned to face Marcus, who stood and walked to her side. "Marcus Chen is a talented pianist," Eleanor said. Tonight was not his best performance, but that does not define him. What defines him is that when he was lost and afraid, he let someone help him. He let the music be bigger than his pride. That is the heart of a true musician. Marcus bowed his head, and when he looked up there was gratitude in his eyes that went beyond words. Eleanor turned back to the audience and her voice grew softer. I stopped playing because I lost my reason to, she said. Tonight I found a new one. It was not fame or recognition or applause. It was helping someone else find their way back to the music. I do not know what comes next for me, and I am not ready to return to the concert stage, but I am ready to stop. Hiding the hall erupted again, but this time it was different. People were cheering and crying and calling out encouragement. The elderly man who had recognized her was wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. The talent scout from the Morrison Foundation was shaking his head in disbelief. Mia climbed onto the stage and wrapped her grandmother in a tight embrace. "I'm so proud of you," Mia whispered. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and questions and camera flashes. Reporters from local news stations arrived within the hour, and the story of Eleni Vardakis emerging from 15 years of hiding spread across social media before the night was over. By morning, Eleanor's face would be on screens around the world, but in the midst of the chaos, something quieter was happening. Harold approached Eleanor and thanked her again for the music she had played for him weeks ago. He told her that it had helped him begin to heal and that he would never forget her kindness. Doris hugged her and said she had always known there was something special about the quiet woman in the corner. Frank shook her hand with tears in his eyes and said he was honored to have learned alongside a legend, even if he never knew it. And Marcus stood apart from the crowd with a thoughtful expression on his face. The talent scout had approached him after the performance and offered to schedule a proper audition, but Marcus had surprised himself by saying he needed time to think. For the first time in 10 years, he was not desperate for validation, and that felt like its own kind of victory. The weeks that followed brought more changes than Eleanor could have imagined. Concert halls did call and journalists did request interviews, and the classical music world celebrated the return of one of its greatest artists. But Eleanor declined the concert offers and gave only a handful of interviews. She was not ready to go back to that life, and she was not sure she ever would be. What she did do was volunteer to teach at the Hartwell Community Center. She took over the beginner piano class and transformed it into something extraordinary. Students came from all over the region to learn from the legendary Eleni Vardakis, but Eleanor treated them all the same. She taught them that music was not about perfection or competition, but about expression and connection, and Joy Marcus became her assistant, and together they created a program that helped struggling musicians find their way back to their passion. They did not always agree, and their debates about technique and interpretation sometimes echoed through the hallways. But they respected each other and they learned from each other, and the students benefited from both of their perspectives. Old upright piano in the corner of the music room was finally repaired and tuned, and Eleanor continued to play it even though she had access to much finer instruments. There was something about that battered old piano that felt right to her. It had been her companion during the months when she was learning to love music again, and she could not imagine abandoning it now in the first anniversary of the fundraiser. The community center held a special concert to commemorate the night when everything changed. Marcus performed Chopin's Ballade No. 1 again, but this time he played it with confidence and feeling. When he finished, the audience applauded, and Eleanor smiled at him from the front row with pride in her eyes. Then it was her turn. Eleanor walked to the stage and sat down at the grand piano. She had spent weeks deciding what to play, and in the end, the choice was obvious. She played Schubert's Piano Sonata in B-flat major, the piece she had performed at Anton's memorial all those years ago. But this time she did not cry. This time, she played it with gratitude for the years they had shared and hope for the years still to come. When the final note faded into silence, Eleanor looked out at the audience and saw Mia sitting in the front row with tears streaming down her face. She saw Harold and Doris and Frank and Timothy, who had all continued their piano studies. She saw Marcus standing in the wings with a look of deep respect, and she felt something she had not felt in 15 years. She felt whole. The music had brought her back to life, and it would carry her forward into whatever came next. She did not know how many years she had left or what the future would bring, but she knew that she would spend those years doing what she loved, surrounded by people who cared about her. That was more than enough. Lenore rose from the piano and bowed to the audience, and the applause washed over her like a blessing. She had been a legend and she had been lost, and now she was something new. She was a teacher and a grandmother and a member of a community. She was Eleanor Vance and she was Eleni Vardakis, and she was finally at peace with both. And every Tuesday and Thursday morning she arrived at the Hartwell Community Center and sat down at the old upright piano in the corner and taught anyone who wanted to learn, because music was meant to be shared and joy was meant to be passed on, and that was the greatest lesson she had ever learned.